Family's cat disappears after a house fire. 10 years later, they receive a call that leaves them speechless. The piercing shriek of smoke alarms shattered the peaceful autumn night, jolting Linda Thompson awake from her deep slumber. Through the thick haze already filling her bedroom, she could barely make out the glowing red numbers on her nightstand clock. 2:17 a.m. Her heart pounding, she immediately thought of her two sleeping children and Maxwell, their beloved ginger tabby who had been part of their family for the past 8 years. "Tom! The kid!" she screamed, shaking her husband awake. The acrid smell of smoke was getting stronger by the second. Tom sprang into action, years of firefighter training kicking in despite his retirement. "Get Emily and Jake. I'll check downstairs," he commanded, already moving toward the hallway with practiced efficiency. Linda rushed to her children's rooms, her bare feet pounding against the carpet. First Emily, their 12-year-old, then 9-year-old Jake. Both children were thankfully easy to wake, and they quickly followed their well-practiced fire evacuation plan. But as they hurried down the stairs, Linda's heart sank when she didn't see Maxwell in any of his usual spots. "Maxwell!" she called out between coughs, the smoke now thick enough to make her eyes water. "Here, kitty!" The flames had started in the kitchen, and Tom was already trying to contain them with their fire extinguisher. But it was clear the blaze was spreading too quickly. "Linda, we need to get out now." Tom's voice carried the authority of someone who had seen too many families hesitate in these crucial moments. "The fire department is on their way." But Linda couldn't bear the thought of leaving Maxwell behind. The ginger cat had been her comfort through depression, her constant companion during long nights of grading papers, and the first pet her children had ever known. "Just give me one more minute," she pleaded, dropping to her knees to check under furniture. Tom grabbed her arm firmly but gently. "We can't wait. Think of the kids." He gestured to Emily and Jake, who stood trembling by the front door, their faces streaked with tears and soot. Linda knew he was right, but leaving Maxwell behind felt like abandoning a family member. The family rushed outside into the cool October air, joining their neighbors who had gathered on the street. Linda held her children close as they watched their home of 15 years become engulfed in flames. The fire trucks arrived within minutes, their sirens wailing and lights painting the neighborhood in alternating red and white. As the firefighters worked to extinguish the blaze, Linda kept scanning the windows, the roof, and the yard, hoping to see a familiar orange figure darting to safety. But Maxwell never appeared. The children sobbed, not for their toys or their rooms, but for their furry friend who had slept at the foot of their bed since they were toddlers. The fire had started from faulty wiring in their kitchen wall, a silent danger that had been lurking unknown for years. While the house wasn't a total loss, the damage was extensive enough that the Thompsons would need to find temporary housing while repairs were made. But the real loss, the one that hit the family hardest, was Maxwell. For weeks after the fire, they searched the neighborhood. They put up posters, contacted local shelters, and walked the streets calling his name. Emily and Jake insisted on checking the rebuilt kitchen every morning before school, hoping Maxwell had somehow found his way back home during the night. Linda caught herself buying cat food at the grocery store out of habit, only to return it to the shelf with tears in her eyes. Tom tried to help his family move forward, suggesting they could adopt another cat once they were settled back in their renovated home. But Linda couldn't bear the thought. It felt like giving up on Maxwell, like betraying him. How could they replace a cat who had been there through every major family moment for the past 8 years? As months turned into years, Maxwell's absence remained a quiet ache in their hearts. His favorite sunspot by the living room window stood empty, and the children's drawings of him stayed pinned to the refrigerator, fading slightly with time. The family learned to live with the loss, but they never forgot their brave, loving companion who had disappeared into that terrible night. None of them could have imagined that this was just the beginning of a story that would take 10 years to unfold. A tale of survival, coincidence, and the unshakable bonds between pets and their families that would leave them absolutely speechless when the truth finally came to light. Life moved forward for the Thompson family, as it always does, but Maxwell's absence left an emptiness that nothing seemed to fill. The first Christmas after the fire was particularly difficult. Emily had always made an extra stocking for Maxwell, filling it with catnip toys and treats. That year, she still hung his stocking, but it remained heartbreakingly empty. The renovation of their home took 6 months, during which they lived with Linda's sister in the next town over. The children adapted better than expected. They made new friends in their temporary neighborhood and found comfort in their aunt's elderly golden retriever, Bruno. But every night, when the house grew quiet, Linda would find herself reaching down to pet a cat that wasn't there. When they finally moved back into their restored home, everything looked different. The kitchen had been modernized with sleek appliances and granite countertops. The walls wore fresh paint, and new hardwood floors replaced the old carpeting. Yet somehow these improvements only emphasized what was missing. Maxwell's worn scratching post had been destroyed in the fire, and Linda couldn't bring herself to buy a new one. His food and water bowls, once permanent fixtures in the kitchen corner, were now conspicuously absent. Tom, ever the practical problem solver, suggested they channel their grief into helping other animals. The whole family started volunteering at the local animal shelter on weekends. Emily and Jake helped socialize the cats, while Linda used her organizational skills to coordinate adoption events. Tom, with his handyman abilities, repaired cages and built new cat trees for the shelter's residents. Through their volunteer work, they met countless cats, some friendly, some shy, some who even reminded them of Maxwell. Many times, shelter staff would excitedly call Linda about a ginger tabby that had been brought in, but none of them were their Maxwell. Each false alarm reopened the wound, but Linda couldn't stop hoping. Years passed, and the children grew. Emily entered high school, then college, her childhood drawings of Maxwell still preserved in a scrapbook she'd made. Jake joined the track team and sometimes swore he caught glimpses of an orange cat watching him practice from the bleachers, only to find nothing there when he looked again. Linda eventually returned to teaching full-time at the local elementary school, where she found herself telling her students stories about her special cat who disappeared after a fire. The 5th anniversary of Maxwell's disappearance came and went. By then, the Thompsons had helped dozens of cats find new homes through their shelter work, but they still couldn't bring themselves to adopt another pet. The right time never seemed to come. Their home remained pet-free, though not for lack of opportunities or love to give. One day, while cleaning out the attic, Linda found Maxwell's old collar tucked away in a box of salvaged items from the fire. The blue fabric was slightly singed, but the bell still jingled softly, just as it had when Maxwell would prowl through the house late at night. She sat there amid dusty boxes, clutching the collar and allowing herself to really cry for the first time in years. That evening, the family gathered for dinner, as they did every Sunday. Emily was home from college for the weekend, and Jake had just received his driver's license. As they shared stories and laughter over Linda's lasagna, Tom noticed his wife seemed quieter than usual. "I found something today," Linda finally said, pulling the collar from her pocket. The table fell silent as she placed it in the center. Emily reached out and gently touched the bell, causing it to chime softly in the quiet room. "I miss him," Jake said simply, voicing what they all felt. At 17, he was almost grown, but in that moment, he sounded like the 9-year-old boy who had lost his cat. "Do you think he made it out?" Emily asked, the question they'd all wondered about for years but rarely voiced. "Do you think someone else found him?" Tom reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. "Wherever he is, I hope he's had a good life. He was a smart cat, resourceful." Linda managed a small smile. "Sometimes I imagine him living with another family, being loved and spoiled. It helps to think he might be out there somewhere, happy." None of them could have known then how prophetic those words would prove to be, or that they were about to enter the final chapter of a story that had begun on that fiery night 5 years ago. Maxwell's tale wasn't over. In fact, the most unbelievable part was yet to come. The next 5 years brought more changes to the Thompson family. Emily graduated college with a degree in veterinary technology, inspired by her years of volunteer work at the shelter. Jake headed off to university on a track scholarship, leaving Tom and Linda as empty nesters. Their home, once filled with the chaos of teenagers and memories of Maxwell, grew quieter. Linda had finally retired from teaching, dedicating more time to her garden and her work at the animal shelter. She'd become something of a local legend there, known for her uncanny ability to connect with the most traumatized cats. "They can sense kindness," she would tell new volunteers, though privately she wondered if she understood these scared, lost creatures so well, because she still felt a bit lost herself. Tom had taken up photography in retirement, often capturing the neighborhood strays that Linda fed. "You're turning me into a cat person," he'd joke, but Linda would catch him leaving out extra food and talking softly to the cats when he thought no one was watching. Their relationship had deepened through shared grief and healing, like a bone that grows stronger at the point where it was once broken. One particularly cold winter morning, Linda was sorting through donation boxes at the shelter when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from Millbrook, a town nearly 200 miles away. Thinking it might be Emily calling from her new job at a veterinary clinic, she answered quickly. "Mrs. Thompson?" The voice was unfamiliar, belonging to an elderly woman. "My name is Margaret Wheeler. I'm calling about, well, this might sound strange, but I'm calling about a cat." Linda's heart did that familiar little jump it always did when there was news about a cat. Even after all these years, she'd learned to temper her hope with realism. "Yes," she replied carefully. "I have this elderly ginger tabby, you see. He showed up in my garden about 10 years ago, right after that terrible storm we had. I've been caring for him ever since, but recently I had to move into assisted living, and while going through his paperwork, my daughter found something interesting." Linda sat down heavily in her office chair, her free hand gripping the edge of her desk. 10 years. Ginger tabby. She'd had this conversation so many times before, but something felt different this time. Margaret continued, her voice wavering slightly with age and emotion. "When he first arrived, he was quite scraggly and had some singed fur. We took him to the vet, who found an old microchip, but it was damaged, probably by heat, and they couldn't read it properly at the time. Last week, my daughter took him to a new vet who has more modern equipment, and well," she paused and Linda could hear papers rustling. "They were able to read the chip. It's registered to a Linda Thompson in Cedar Grove." The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. Linda's vision blurred with tears as she struggled to find her voice. Does he come when you call him Maxwell?" There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Yes, yes, he does. Oh my goodness, is this really his family? After all this time?" Linda's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. Her mind raced with questions. How had he traveled so far? What had he experienced? Could it really be their Maxwell after all these years? "He's been such a wonderful companion," Margaret was saying, her voice thick with emotion. "Every night for the past decade, he slept on the pillow next to mine. But he's always seemed to be waiting for something, watching the door as if expecting someone to walk through it." Memories flooded back. Maxwell curled up on Emily's pillow, purring as she did her homework. The way he used to wait by the door for Jake to return from school. How he would sit in the kitchen window watching for Tom's car in the driveway. "Mrs. Wheeler," Linda managed to say, wiping her eyes, "would it be possible? Could we—" "Come see him," Margaret finished for her. "My daughter and I were hoping you would. We're at Sunset Haven Assisted Living in Millbrook. He's here with me. They made an exception for him because, well, he's quite special." Linda glanced at the clock. It was just past 9 in the morning. "I need to make some calls," she said, already mentally calculating how quickly she could reach her family. "But we'll be there. Today, as soon as we can get everyone together." As she hung up the phone, Linda sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Then, with trembling fingers, she began to dial Tom's number. Their impossible story was about to come full circle. But first, she had to gather her family for what would surely be the most extraordinary reunion of their lives. The 3-hour drive to Millbrook felt like an eternity. Tom drove while Linda repeatedly checked her phone, coordinating with Emily and Jake. Emily had immediately left the veterinary clinic where she worked, telling her supervisor this was a family emergency. Jake was catching the next flight from his university, though he wouldn't arrive until evening. "What if it's not him?" Linda whispered, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her since the phone call. "What if we're getting our hopes up for nothing?" Tom reached over and squeezed her hand, keeping his eyes on the road. "The microchip matches, honey, and he responds to his name. How many ginger cats named Maxwell could there be with burn marks from 10 years ago?" Linda nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. She'd brought Maxwell's old collar, still slightly singed from the fire, tucked safely in her purse. The familiar weight of it pressed against her leg, a tangible link to the past they were racing toward. Emily called again as they were nearing Millbrook. "I'm about 20 minutes behind you," she said, her voice crackling with excitement and nervous energy. "Jake's flight lands at 6. He said to go ahead without him. He doesn't want us to wait." Sunset Haven Assisted Living was a peaceful complex surrounded by well-maintained gardens. As they pulled into the parking lot, Linda spotted Emily's car turning onto the street. "Wait for your sister," Tom said gently, seeing Linda's hand already reaching for the door handle. The family reunion in the parking lot was brief but emotional. Emily hugged her parents tightly, her veterinary scrubs still on under her coat. "I can't believe this might really be happening," she said, wiping away tears. Margaret Wheeler's daughter, Anne, met them in the lobby. She was a kind-faced woman in her 50s who smiled warmly as she led them to her mother's room. "Mom's been so excited," she explained. "Maxwell's been acting differently too, like he knows something's happening. He hasn't left her side all day." They paused outside room 217. Linda's hands were trembling so badly that Tom wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Emily stood close on her other side, holding her mother's hand. Anne knocked softly and opened the door. Margaret Wheeler sat in a comfortable armchair by the window, afternoon sunlight streaming in behind her. And there, curled up in her lap, was a ginger tabby cat with distinctive white patches on his chest and paws. Linda's knees went weak. Even before the cat lifted his head, she knew. Those eyes. She would have known those eyes anywhere. They were older now, just like all of them, but they held the same intelligent, loving expression she remembered. "Maxwell," she whispered. The cat's ears pricked forward. He rose slowly, stretching in that familiar way she had seen thousands of times before. His movements were stiffer now, showing his age, but the grace was still there. Maxwell looked directly at Linda, and then he did something he had always done when she returned home from school. He chirped. It was a distinctive sound, halfway between a meow and a trill, that had been unique to him. Linda burst into tears. Emily gasped beside her. "Mom, that's his sound! That's Maxwell's special sound!" The cat jumped down from Margaret's lap, moving toward them with purpose. Linda knelt on the floor, not caring about dignity or decorum. Maxwell reached her and immediately bumped his head against her hand. Another old habit, his way of demanding attention. "Oh, my sweet boy," Linda sobbed, gently scratching under his chin in the spot she had never forgotten. Maxwell began to purr, the sound rusty but strong. He pressed himself against her, just as he had done thousands of times before, and Linda carefully gathered him into her arms. Emily knelt beside them, her veterinary training warring with her emotions as she tried to both examine and hug their long-lost pet. Tom stood watching, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. Margaret and Anne observed the reunion with matching expressions of joy and bittersweet sadness. "He's been loved," Margaret said softly. "Every day for 10 years he's been loved. But I always knew he had another family out there somewhere. He's been waiting for you." Maxwell moved from Linda to Emily, chirping again as he recognized her scent. Then he approached Tom, weaving between his legs just as he used to do. The familiar gesture broke Tom's composure completely, and he joined his family on the floor. They were still there sharing stories and tears when Jake arrived early evening. His entrance made Maxwell chirp yet again, and the reunion began anew as their youngest family member dropped his travel bag and sank to his knees, overcome with emotion. None of them could have imagined on that terrible night 10 years ago that they would be here now, in this room, their family finally complete again. But sometimes the most incredible stories are the ones that take the longest to tell. And the Thompson story wasn't quite finished yet. The next few hours in Margaret's room at Sunset Haven became a celebration none of them would ever forget. The facility's staff, hearing about the extraordinary reunion, brought in coffee and cookies. Maxwell moved from lap to lap, seeming to relish the attention from both his families, past and present. Linda sat close to Margaret, their hands clasped together as they shared a decade's worth of stories. They learned that on the night of the fire, Maxwell had apparently fled in terror, running farther than anyone could have imagined. A severe storm the following week had likely driven him even farther from home, eventually leading him to Margaret's garden. nearly 200 miles away. He was so scared and hurt when he first arrived, Margaret recalled, gently stroking Maxwell's aging fur. The vet said he had minor burns and smoke inhalation. I tried to find his owners, but the damaged microchip, she shook her head. I like to think he found me because we both needed someone at that time. I just lost my husband, you see. He has a way of knowing when he's needed, Linda agreed, remembering how Maxwell had helped her through her depression years ago. The two women shared a knowing look, united by their love for this remarkable cat. As evening approached, they faced the delicate question of what would happen next. It was Emily, with her veterinary background, who addressed it first. Maxwell is 15 now, she said gently. At his age, a major move could be very stressful, and he's clearly bonded with Mrs. Wheeler. Margaret spoke up, her voice quavering slightly. I'll be honest, the thought of letting him go breaks my heart, but he's your cat. He always was. Linda looked at Maxwell, now dozing contentedly in Margaret's lap, and made a decision that surprised even herself. No, she said softly. He's your cat now, Margaret. This is his home. Tom squeezed his wife's shoulder, understanding and pride in his eyes. Jake and Emily exchanged glances, then nodded in agreement. But, Linda continued, if you're willing, we'd love to be part of his life again. We could visit regularly. Maybe we could even help with his care, especially when you need it. She glanced at Anne, who smiled gratefully. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I'd like that very much, she whispered. We both would. Over the next few months, the Thompsons became frequent visitors to Sunset Haven. Emily took charge of Maxwell's veterinary care, monitoring his health with loving attention. Jake, whenever home from university, would bring his laptop and study in Margaret's room, with Maxwell purring on his lap just like old times. Linda and Margaret developed a deep friendship, bonded by their shared love for one extraordinary cat. They spoke daily, exchanging photos and updates, and Margaret's room soon filled with pictures of both families, a testament to how love can expand to embrace more people rather than being divided. Maxwell lived for another 2 peaceful years, cherished by both families. When he finally passed away, it was on his own terms in Margaret's room, with Linda holding one of his paws and Margaret the other. They buried him in a sunny spot in the Sunset Haven Gardens, where residents and staff still leave flowers on his grave. The story of Maxwell's incredible journey in double life became something of a legend at Sunset Haven. But for the Thompsons and Margaret Wheeler, it was more than just an amazing tale. It was a reminder that love, once given, never truly disappears. It can survive fire and storm, traverse hundreds of miles, and even multiply, touching more hearts than anyone could imagine. Today, Linda volunteers at Sunset Haven, bringing certified therapy cats to visit the residents. She often tells Maxwell's story to new residents, showing them the photos she keeps in her wallet. A ginger tabby cat surrounded by 2 families, all smiling at the camera. In the picture, Maxwell looks supremely satisfied, as if he had planned it all along, bringing together 2 families who needed each other just as much as they had needed him. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun sets over the gardens where Maxwell rests, Linda swears she can hear a familiar chirp on the breeze, a sound halfway between a meow and a trill, reminding her that the most precious things in life can never be lost, only transformed into something even more beautiful than we could have imagined.